The screencast will cover 1968 and the television group. So this is the first topic to go for the 50s, 60s presentation that we've been assigned earlier in the marking period. And so this screencast will be similar to another one that is posted on the same topic, the only difference being this one will use notes, and YouTube seems to flag some of the items in the other one, so I don't know if that one is always going to be available. So we're going to first start off with all of the topics. So the topics that were selected, you see all of those particular topics here, and they all have something to do with the time period that we're looking at, the 50s, 60s, and then you also have some long-term causes for events like the War on Terror. You start to see the birth of hackers in the 80s. That comes right out of 1968 with the invention of the ARPANET. So that gives you some idea of the topics here that we are looking at that you are responsible for as a class. Looking at this chart here, this chart I tried to outline the significance of these events. All of these project topics are primarily at their peak in this particular point right here. So although they may have some long-term impact, going back as far as some of the causes. For example, we look here at the Vietnam War down here, the fight for civil rights. We also see some connections to the present, which was already addressed. So the first topic we're going to look at here is 1968. So with this particular slide, what I did here is I've used the image of an umbrella, and I'm trying to get you to think about the many groups that emerged in the 1960s. So when we think about the political spectrum, people being on the left and people being on the right, the people on the right, I always remember them as the people trying to preserve, and these are individuals that want change or they want something new. So here we see the 1920s, some issues. So these would be items from the left of the 1920s. Their issues, abortion, suffrage, segregation, and some of these ideas still kind of play out in the 60s. But notice here we use the new left. The new left is a term that is for the late 60s. And why? Because you see a bunch of groups that are coming in, and some of these groups were not part of this particular movement here. So for this one, we're going to put the Chicano movement advocating for Mexican Americans. Here we see an image of the Mattachine Society. These individuals are advocating for gay rights. We see Linda Brown, segregation. What else do we have here? Native Americans starting to emerge, conducting their fish-in protests. Women, we have some women issues over here with regard to abortion and suffrage. So women. So this term, the new left, is looking at some of those new groups that necessarily were not part of the 1920s. We also want to take note of this phrase here, tale of two 60s. And this is another term that historians use when looking at the 60s. We could look at the beginning and the end, and I'll just use the middle, 1965. So the tale of two 60s is pretty much just looking at the issue that in the early part of the 60s, the groups advocating for change, they really were not as violent or willing to resort to violence as they were over here. Over this particular point, we were talking about, protests. We might be talking about the sit-ins. We might be talking about the sip-ins, nonviolent methods like the boycott. But by the time you get here, it almost seems like there is a breaking point. And that could be a result of the Vietnam War. I didn't mention this one here. It says abolish the draft. You start to see these groups, whether they're Chicano, whether they're the Black Panther Party, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, the New York Radical Women that breaks off and creates the witches. All of these groups right here, they align themselves or also start to have some sort of link to the war movement, and that is the war protesting Vietnam. So when we're looking at this particular slide here, you want to take note of the new left and the tale of two 60s. They're kind of just addressed right there. So the new left and that anti-war movement, again, starts to heat up as a result of the violence in the war in Vietnam. So here we see an image of a South Vietnamese soldier that is allied with the United States. I'm just going to put plus the USA, and they're fighting against the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the NLF, whatever group that they seem to be fighting. But for the most part, this is a war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. So in this image here, you see somebody who is suspected of taking up arms and siding with the North, and you see this ally of the U.S. shoot this individual. And it was a turning point for the war, just like the My Lai massacre was a turning point for the war. You just see by the late 60s just a lot of things going on with the Vietnam War that many Americans started to disagree with. And again, going back to the tale of two 60s, again, it's that submissive, docile protest. By the time you get to the mid-late 60s, you start to see some violence. A couple of other contributing factors, you could say the assassination of Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Dr. King, Robert Kennedy. You see a series of events that are happening in the late 60s, going back to that point, this concept of two 60s that exist. And that's what you see here, some of the incidents that have taken place. Didn't mention the Days of Rage. This group right here would eventually create a terrorist organization called the Weathered Underground, and they would have some significance in the 1970s. Keep in mind JFK's assassination also happening a little earlier in the 60s, but right there at that point where there's about to be a turning point. So here's the summary pause for this particular topic. These are the items that you want to focus on: the tale of two 60s, the new left, images from television, which is really the group that is about to go next, because this topic here is TV. But if you go back to some of those images, like the Tet Offensive, maybe you look up the My Lai Massacre, Napalm Girl, all of these images showed violence. And those images from television are going to play a key role. By the time you get to the 70s, you see some of this playing out in the music. Not that it wasn't in the 60s, but looking at some of the lyrics at the bottom here by these two artists, feel free to look these up on YouTube so I don't get copyright flagged. By listening to the song or reading lyrics, looking at war, talking about not escalating, war is not the answer, only love can conquer hate. This is a song by Gil Scott-Heron, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, and here he's talking about black empowerment, black pride, black nationalism, and looking at the question of whether or not African Americans in society, American society, should revolt. As he says here, the revolution is not going to be on televised. What are you going to do? All right, so we're going to transition here into television. So television, we see playing a role in a couple of items, social, military, and political. This group was asked to come up with a series of images, a book, do a commercial for a TV dinner, and that's precisely what this is. This is an advertisement for a TV dinner. In the 1950s, you start to see the television really becoming a household item. And that household item, you're starting to see the advertisement. I was about to say birth of advertisement. That's more of the 1920s. But you see a new form of advertisement, advertising on television. And then you see items that are marketed. For example, the TV dinner. If you didn't notice, this is what a television could look like in the 1950s. This right here playing the role of a knob. This could possibly be the volume. This was the way to turn the channel station. So they definitely are picking up on the craze of the television in the 1950s. So how much of an impact? Now this question here, looking at the popularity of TV dinners, and again, we're talking here about changing of eating habits. Society is about to become fast. It's speeding up. We're talking about cars, suburban growth. There's a lot going on here, and people simply just don't have time. So here you see some other items that are starting to be marketed. You see advertisements marketing towards Mexican Americans, TV dinners from your Chinese grandmother. And that's probably going to come up on the next slide. And these come from the book Food is Love by Catherine Parkin, where she simply looked at a series of these advertisements. So the point here, television, new phenomenon, and you start to see advertisements and new inventions like the TV dinner starting to play a role. So here is that image again of the TV dinner that is from your Chinese grandmother, as it says right here, your Chinese grandmother. So here you see a TV dinner um, that is trying to introduce Americans to what they feel is processed Chinese cuisine. This particular image is looking at the kids here looking at the television and eating at the TV. Why is that significant? It's about changing family values. Prior to the television playing a role, you could be in a situation where the family sits down and eats dinner. But now we have the bonus of the television that is possibly intruding on family TV dinner and quality family time. Uh, this possibly would also play out present day when you're at the phone, using your phone at dinner, and maybe your guardian parent yells at you and says, "Hey, get off the phone." Just the same idea that kind of plays out here. Anyway, let's move on. Some more images. So this was an image from the New Left, the anti-war movement that I intentionally left out. This one here, this is an image of Napalm Girls. Remember, this topic here is television. So if you're looking at the Tet Offensive, if you're looking at Napalm Girl, this historic photograph, this girl's village being bombed with napalm, running from her village, burned. In some cases, if you were to look at images, they'd be pretty horrific. People with, skin removed, attached to their clothing. And again, these are images because the topic here is television, like this one here. This is an image of the Birmingham protests where civil rights demonstrators, teenagers, were attacked with dogs. Another item for television is the changing of politics. Now, I use here the Lincoln-Douglas debate of 1858. If you were going to vote in this election, you probably would have to really go out to hear any of these individuals. Your ability to listen to this is not going to happen unless you're physically there. In the 1920s, maybe you're listening to politicians on the radio because the radio is a new invention that's starting to pick up. And this is the impact of the first televised debate between Nixon and JFK. So here's JFK. This individual is Nixon. He is the Democrat. He is the Republican running. And in the first televised debate here, if you click this link, it'll show there are a couple of items. People would say that if you watched it, they felt he won. If they listened to it on the radio, they felt he won. And the argument that's usually made is that JFK hired people from Hollywood to direct him, to prep him, and he's looking directly into the camera. Nixon, who was coming off of an illness, seemed a little off, as you see him here with his, handkerchief here, dealing with his illness. All of that stuff became visual. The voter was able to see that, as this individual just came off visually different in comparison to Nixon. When we look at the electoral votes here, as I said before, people listening to this debate on the radio felt Nixon. People watching it felt JFK had won. Either way, it doesn't matter. JFK would become the next president, and his vice president would be a man by the name of Lyndon Johnson. There's an argument to be made that Nixon is viewed as that Ivy League from the Northeast, a Democrat, whereas Lyndon Johnson was from the South. And so Lyndon Johnson was selected primarily for his ability to bring in voters from the South. That definitely created some tension between the two individuals, JFK and his brother Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy did not seem to get along with Lyndon Johnson. And that's going to play a role for the topic JFK and Lyndon Johnson presidency, which is another topic, so I'm not going to say anything additional about that. I included this slide here just to get you to think about elections present day with the use of internet, the ability to raise funds through social media. And Obama, when he was running for president, seemed to really was the first president to use that social media to his advantage. And of course, this would continue into the Trump presidency as well as the Biden presidency with those particular elections. This image is again about those changing family values. The difference here that was already addressed: eating dinner with the family as opposed to eating dinner with the family and watching television. TV summary pause. These are the items you want to take note of that are right here. The rise of fast food and time, and that is a reference to fast food. Places like McDonald's that are about to start to really become a cultural phenomenon at this point. And again, the issue of time, that TV dinner, that fast food is definitely going to be able to save some time. Maybe you no longer have to spend 1 hour cooking food. You could possibly cut that down to 10 minutes. If we studied women's history, if this was a class on women's history in the United States, we would probably be looking at how, even though the mother, the traditional 1950s nuclear family, how the woman with that additional time, what would she be able to do? Probably more chores that conform to the four virtues. And if you know what that is, you should get that. If you don't, look it up. All right, that's it for these topics.